On January 7, 1945, the Ardennes forest lay frozen beneath deep snow, while inside a British press tent the mood was charged with excitement. Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery stood confidently before a row of microphones as camera flashes lit his sharp, unmistakable face. He wore a smile that was not born of exhaustion, but of self-assurance. Speaking to reporters, he described the Battle of the Bulge as one of the most complex operations he had ever managed. Again and again, he framed the victory around himself, portraying American forces less as equal partners and more as troops he had personally rescued. To the press, it sounded heroic. To General Dwight D. Eisenhower, reading the transcript nearby, it was infuriating. Eisenhower had spent years holding the Allied coalition together through patience and restraint. He endured criticism, ignored insults, and placed unity above ego. But Montgomery's words crossed a line. The alliance between British and American commands had always been uneasy, built on necessity rather than trust. Eisenhower believed war was a collective effort, while Montgomery saw it as a stage for individual brilliance. He viewed himself as indispensable and quietly dismissed Eisenhower as a political figure unfit for true battlefield command. As the war progressed, tensions only grew. Montgomery pressed for total control of ground forces, a demand that angered Washington and forced Churchill to repeatedly intervene. Eisenhower continued to shield him, convinced that Montgomery's battlefield skill justified the strain. Yet by the winter of 1944, reality had shifted. The United States now supplied the majority of troops, equipment, and resources, while Montgomery still behaved as if Britain held senior authority. The German surprise attack through the Ardennes shattered American lines and forced Eisenhower into a difficult decision. To restore order, he temporarily placed 2 American armies under Montgomery's command. Though the move made military sense, it deeply wounded American pride. Montgomery, instead of acting as a caretaker, asserted himself aggressively, overruling plans, delaying counterattacks, and lecturing seasoned American commanders as if they were novices. While he succeeded in stabilizing the front, he poisoned relations within Allied headquarters. His public statements made matters worse. At the January press conference, Montgomery presented a version of the battle that minimized American sacrifice and elevated his own role. He overlooked the defense of Bastogne, ignored Patton's rapid counteroffensive, and reduced a brutal struggle costing thousands of American lives to a clever strategic puzzle. British newspapers celebrated him, but within the U.S. command, anger boiled over. Eisenhower responded quietly but decisively. He drafted a message to Washington stating that trust within the command structure had collapsed. His ultimatum was clear: either Montgomery changed or Eisenhower would step aside. It was a final line, drawn without drama. When Montgomery was warned of the situation, the reality struck hard. For the first time, he understood that his position was truly in danger. The following day, Eisenhower received a letter written in a far humbler tone. Montgomery apologized, pledged loyalty, and submitted himself completely to Eisenhower's authority. The apology was accepted, but the damage was permanent. Montgomery retained his rank, but his influence faded. From that moment on, American commanders took the lead in the final push into Germany. The Battle of the Bulge is often remembered for frozen forests and armored clashes, yet its most decisive confrontation occurred far from the battlefield. It was a battle of leadership, restraint, and authority. Montgomery believed brilliance alone was enough. Eisenhower proved that in war, unity and respect mattered just as much as strategy, and that no individual, however talented, stood above the mission. Part 1. Ego, Alliance, and the Edge of Collapse. The winter of 1944 was one of the coldest Europe had seen in decades. In the Ardennes forest, snow blanketed the ground so deeply that tanks struggled to move and soldiers froze in their foxholes. Trees stood silent and brittle, their branches weighed down by ice, while the distant thunder of artillery echoed through valleys that seemed abandoned by life itself. It was in this frozen landscape that the fate of the Western Allied alliance came dangerously close to unraveling, not because of German firepower alone, but because of clashing personalities at the very top of command. On January 7, 1945, Inside a British press tent not far from the front, warmth returned in the form of attention and applause. Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery stepped forward confidently, framed by microphones and flashing cameras. His uniform was immaculate, his posture rigid, his expression sharp and unmistakably self-assured. To the journalists gathered before him, Montgomery looked every bit the victorious commander. His voice was calm, deliberate, and unwavering as he described the recently concluded Battle of the Bulge. He called it one of the most tricky battles he had ever handled. To Montgomery, the words felt modest. To others, they were incendiary. As he spoke, he placed himself at the center of the narrative. He described decisive actions taken under his command, decisions made with clarity and foresight, and a crisis resolved through firm leadership. American forces appeared in his account largely as units in distress, forces that required guidance, stabilization, and rescue. The word "I" surfaced repeatedly, subtly but unmistakably shaping the story around a single man's brilliance. British reporters scribbled enthusiastically. After years of war defined by sacrifice and decline, here was a British hero again, standing tall on the continent, claiming mastery over the largest battle fought by Western forces during World War II. In London, editors were already imagining triumphant headlines. But less than a kilometer away, in a quiet office at Supreme Allied Headquarters, another man was reading the same words with growing disbelief. General Dwight D. Eisenhower sat at his desk, the transcript of Montgomery's press conference clenched in his hands. His face, usually calm and controlled, hardened with each line. Eisenhower was not a man prone to anger. Throughout the war, his greatest strength had been his patience, his ability to absorb insults, manage egos, and keep a vast, multinational alliance functioning under immense pressure. But this was different. Montgomery's speech was not merely self-promotion. It was a public rewriting of reality. It diminished the sacrifice of American soldiers, ignored the heroism of entire divisions, and threatened the fragile trust that held the Allied command together. Eisenhower felt something he rarely allowed himself to feel: cold, focused fury. For years, Eisenhower had tolerated Montgomery's arrogance. He had defended him against American criticism, shielded him from political consequences, and accepted behavior that would have ended the career of almost any other commander. He believed that Montgomery's caution, planning, and battlefield discipline brought value to the alliance. Operation footage, massive scale of deception. Narrator, VO. For 2 weeks, they created an entire fake army. Over 600 inflatable vehicles. Miles of fake tank tracks created by dragging logs behind jeeps. Radio operators sent thousands of fake messages, using the call signs and patterns of real divisions. Radio chatter, coded military communications. Narrator, VO. The sonic units played their recordings at full volume. The sounds of a massive force preparing for assault echoed through the night. German intelligence reports, documents shown. Narrator, VO. German intelligence intercepted the radio traffic. Their reconnaissance planes photographed the fake installations. They moved artillery and armor to defend against the crossing at Viersen. Actual crossing footage. Narrator, VO. On March 23, the real 9th Army crossed at Wesel, meeting lighter resistance than expected. The Germans had been fooled. The Ghost Army had pulled off their greatest triumph. Act 3, Legacy and Revelation, 45:00, 60:00. The End of the War, 45:00, 50:00. Footage, V-Day celebrations. Narrator, VO. In May 1945, the war in Europe ended. The Ghost Army had conducted over 20 major tactical deceptions. They had impersonated more than a dozen different divisions. Intelligence estimates suggest their operations saved between 15,000 and 30,000 American lives. Portraits, Ghost Army members. Narrator, VO. But there would be no medals, no public recognition. Every man was required to sign a secrecy oath. They returned home, and the Ghost Army vanished from history. The long silence, 50:00, 53:00. Photos, post-war America. Narrator, VO. For nearly 4 decades, These men carried their secret. Bill Blass built his fashion empire. Ellsworth Kelly became one of America's most celebrated artists. Others became teachers, businessmen, fathers, and grandfathers. Veteran interviews. Veteran 3. My own children didn't know what I did during the war. I wanted to tell them so many times. But we had sworn an oath. Narrator, VO. It wasn't until 1985 that portions of the Ghost Army's history were declassified. Even then, many documents remained sealed. Recognition at last. 53:00, 57:00. Recent footage, Veterans Reunions, 1990s to 2000s. Narrator, VO. In 1996, the surviving members of the Ghost Army held their first reunion. Men who had been sworn to silence for half a century could finally share their stories. Veteran gathering. Elderly men examining old photographs. Veteran 4. We thought history had forgotten us. But we never forgot each other or what we did. Narrator, VO. Documentaries were made. Books were written. In 2013, their story was featured in a PBS documentary. Museums began displaying their equipment and artwork. Footage, Congressional Ceremony, 2022. Narrator, VO. In 2022, 77 years after the end of World War II, Congress finally awarded the Ghost Army the Congressional Gold Medal, one of America's highest civilian honors. Survivors at ceremony, elderly veterans receiving recognition. Narrator, VO. Only a handful of Ghost Army veterans were still alive to receive it. But they received it for all of them. Closing, 57:00, 60:00. Montage. Original artwork created by Ghost Army members during and after the war. Narrator, VO. The Ghost Army proved that warfare isn't just about firepower and numbers. Sometimes, the greatest weapon is the human imagination. Interviews. Modern military strategists. Military historian. What the Ghost Army accomplished laid the groundwork for modern military deception doctrine. Their techniques are still studied and adapted today. Final images. Ghost Army patches, memorials, artworks. Narrator, VO. These artists who became soldiers, these soldiers who remained artists, showed that creativity and courage are not opposites. They painted with tanks instead of brushes. They composed symphonies of deception. And they helped win a war. Veteran final words. Veteran 5, elderly, speaking to camera. People ask me, were you scared? Of course we were scared. But we had a job to do. We were artists, but we were also Americans. And we did our part. Fade to black. Narrator, VO. The Ghost Army. 1,000 men who deceived an enemy, saved countless lives, and remained silent for decades. Their story reminds us that in the darkest times, creativity and innovation can be as powerful as any weapon. Final title card. Text on screen. Between June 1944 and March 1945, the Ghost Army conducted 21 battlefield deceptions. They are credited with saving an estimated 15,000 to 30,000 Allied lives. Their story remained classified for 40 years. In 2022, they received the Congressional Gold Medal. This is their legacy. As Patton drove his Third Army north through snow-choked roads in one of the most remarkable maneuvers of the war, he fumed at Montgomery's control of the narrative. His soldiers were advancing under brutal conditions, rescuing encircled units and restoring the front, yet Montgomery spoke as if the battle were his alone to win. Patton privately urged Eisenhower to remove Montgomery from any command over American troops, warning that morale within the U.S. Army was cracking. The anger was not limited to senior generals. Staff officers whispered openly. Some joked bitterly that the Americans were now fighting two wars, one against the Germans and another against British arrogance. Others questioned whether Allied unity was still real or merely a facade maintained for public consumption. The resentment was deep, and it was spreading. Montgomery, meanwhile, appeared either unaware of the damage he was causing or unconcerned by it. In his mind, results justified behavior. The Northern Front had been stabilized. German momentum had been broken. From his perspective, criticism was merely the sound of bruised egos. He interpreted American silence as acceptance and their obedience as confirmation that he was right. This miscalculation would prove nearly fatal to his career. While Montgomery reorganized lines and delayed counterattacks to ensure overwhelming preparation, American commanders viewed his caution as self-serving. They believed he was positioning himself for personal credit rather than swift victory. Each passing day hardened their belief that Montgomery cared more about history's judgment than the men freezing in foxholes. The breaking point arrived not on the battlefield, but in the newspapers. When British headlines began declaring that Monty saved the Americans, outrage exploded within the U.S. command. The narrative implied that American forces had collapsed entirely and required British intervention to avoid disaster. This was not merely inaccurate, it was insulting. Thousands of American soldiers had fought stubbornly, delaying the German advance at tremendous cost. Units like the 101st Airborne at Bastogne had become symbols of defiance under impossible conditions, yet Montgomery barely acknowledged them. General Bradley confronted Eisenhower directly. He stated plainly that he could not continue serving under a command structure that allowed Montgomery to publicly demean American sacrifice. If the situation did not change, Bradley was prepared to resign. For Eisenhower, this was an alarming development. Bradley was not a man prone to emotional outbursts. His willingness to step aside signaled how deeply the trust within the alliance had eroded. Patton was even more direct. He demanded to be unleashed without restraint, arguing that the best response to German aggression and British condescension was decisive American action. He questioned whether Montgomery's delays had unnecessarily prolonged the battle. While Eisenhower valued Patton's aggressiveness, he also understood the danger of allowing internal conflict to spiral further. Inside Supreme Allied headquarters, Eisenhower faced the greatest test of his command. The German threat was still real, but the alliance itself was in danger of fracture. He could not afford open rebellion among American generals, nor could he risk a political crisis with Britain. Every option carried risk. Eisenhower's leadership style had always been rooted in compromise, but compromise now seemed insufficient. Montgomery's behavior had crossed from difficult to destructive. His press statements, in particular, had transformed private frustration into public insult. By elevating himself at the expense of his allies, Montgomery had undermined the very coalition that made victory possible. What troubled Eisenhower most was the realization that this was not a misunderstanding. Montgomery genuinely believed his version of events. He saw no need to apologize because he did not believe he had done anything wrong. This made reconciliation far more difficult. As the days passed, Eisenhower grew increasingly convinced that the problem could no longer be managed quietly. The American command structure was on the brink of revolt. Trust, once broken, would not easily be repaired. The war demanded unity, but unity could not survive humiliation. Behind closed doors, Eisenhower began considering a step he had long avoided. Removing Montgomery would be explosive, but allowing him to continue unchecked might be even worse. The alliance could not function if its commanders no longer respected one another. By early January, Eisenhower understood that he faced a decision that would define not only the remainder of the war, but the future balance of power within the Allied coalition. The peacemaker was nearing the end of his patience. The next move would not be about diplomacy, it would be about authority. And quietly, deliberately, Eisenhower began to prepare his ultimatum.